All right, welcome back. This is the second lecture to lecture 20, where we're going to start to take a look at the lymphatic system. So, what is the lymphatic system? So, it's different from all the other systems. I feel like most students are not as familiar with the lymphatic system as they may have been with some of the other systems that we've talked about. So you can tell just by looking at this image. So you can see here is the circulatory system on the left, and you can see the lymphatic system on the right. And what you should be able to notice pretty quickly is that the lymphatic system runs along the same, like it's in the same vicinity as the circulatory system because they kind of work hand in hand. So let's talk a little bit about the functions of the lymphatic system, and then I think the role of what this system does will become more clear as we talk about it. So the one of the main functions of the lymphatic system is to produce, maintain, and distribute lymphocytes. So we just got done talking about the different types of white blood cells where I introduced you to lymphocytes. And these are cells that are involved in fighting infection. So any types of pathogens that enter our body, lymphocytes will help. They'll work with our immune system to fight off these pathogens. So these lymphocytes are produced and stored within lymphatic organs. So the lymphatic system is composed of specific lymphatic organs that I'll outline here in a moment, but they are consist of the spleen, the thymus, and the bone marrow. Because remember, we've talked about bone marrow and how that is where all red blood cells and white blood cells are produced. We have a couple other lymphatic organs that we'll now talk about, such as the spleen and the thymus. And so what the lymphatic system is doing is it is working closely with the circulatory system. So it is going to maintain normal blood volume. So one of the things you need to consider is when we were talking about capillaries and we were talking about how leaky they were, there's a lot of fluid that escapes these capillary beds, and that fluid needs to go somewhere. And so lots of times the lymphatic system will pick up that extra fluid. And that fluid is a byproduct of blood. So by picking up that released contents of those vessels, that blood, it will help maintain blood volume. All right, so because it's associated with the circulatory system, it is going to provide alternative routes for transporting hormones, nutrients, and waste from tissues. And this should all become more clear as we work through this lecture. So let's take a look at some of the components that are in the lymphatic system. So again, at these capillary beds, there's going to be a lot of fluid that gets leaked out of these blood vessels. So just to be clear, when it's in the blood vessels, it's called blood, okay? When it leaks out of the blood vessels at capillary beds, because remember, these capillaries are leaky, it then becomes interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that's being leaked out of those capillary beds, which is mostly plasma. And then it's going, this extra fluid, like we don't want extra fluid in our body, that would cause swelling. We need that extra fluid to be picked up. And that extra fluid is picked up by the lymphatic system. And as soon as it enters the lymphatic system, the name changes to lymph. It's generally this same product. So it's blood when it's in the blood vessels. it's interstitial fluid. That's just what it's called when it leaks out. And then it's picked back up by the lymphatic system and becomes lymph. But it's basically a product called plasma that, again, if we lost too much of it, our blood volume would decrease. So it needs to be picked up again. And it's picked up by a series, like a network of vessels, okay? So this network of lymphatic vessels, or other term called, just generally speaking, lymphatics, these are highly permeable vessels. And I'm going to go on and show you exactly what these vessels look like and how they interact with those capillary beds. And just as I was telling you, lymph is what it's called when it enters the lymphatic vessels. We now call it lymph. All right. And again, it's mostly plasma. All right. There's a system of there's several other components of the lymphatic system. So we have lymph nodes, right, throughout the entire body. This fluid that's being picked up by these vessels, this interstitial fluid, which then becomes lymph, is going to flow through lymph nodes. And that's basically a cleansing system so that that fluid, because ultimately that fluid needs to go back into our blood supply, and it's going to enter the venous blood supply. It's going to head back towards the heart so it can enter the blood vessels again. But before it enters those blood vessels, we need to make sure that there's no debris or waste or anything that shouldn't be there. So it's going to get filtered through lymph nodes. And then the cell type that is present to make sure or to ensure that if there's any pathogens present, these lymphocytes can then attack anything that might not be there and make sure that it's removed. And it will also run through a series of lymphatic organs. All right, so all of these things make up the lymphatic system. So this is a really nice overview of what's happening in the lymphatic system. All right, so just to give a nice big picture look at this. So we have the heart here. And as we've talked about, we have blood leaving the heart that is rich in oxygen. So it's oxygen-rich blood. And it's headed toward these capillary beds to deliver oxygen, okay? And in these capillary beds, there's going to be some fluid loss, right? Some blood fluid loss, which is mostly plasma. You have the lymphatic system, which is outlined here, which is going to be tightly associated with these capillary beds to begin to pick up any excess fluid that might be there. All right. And just as we have blood returning back to the heart that is now oxygen poor, we need a system to pick up this extra fluid down here. And that's what the lymphatic system is doing. So you can see these lymphatic vessels here in green. They're going to pick up that extra fluid. That fluid is going to travel back towards the heart. This is a one-way system, okay? It's from the capillary bed to the heart. That's all. It's not a round trip. It's one way. And along the way, it's going to stop and filter through lymph nodes. We have various lymph nodes throughout our body. So lymph will flow through the lymph nodes so that it can be cleansed. And then it will ultimately make its way back to the heart and re-enter the circulatory system. So that kind of sums up what the lymphatic system is doing. We're going to go into a little bit more details and talk about the anatomy and the structures of the vessels as well as the lymphatic organs, but this is a nice overview of what's going on. So let's take a closer look at the structure of the lymphatic vessels. So again, the lymphatic vessels are carrying lymph only from peripheral tissues back to the venous system so that we can bring that blood back into the circulatory system. And just like blood vessels, lymphatic vessels range in size as well. So the smallest ones are capillaries. Then they transition into larger vessels called vessels. Then they become collecting vessels or trunks. And then the largest lymphatic vessels are called ducts. And these ducts will ultimately lead toward the heart or to the heart. All right, so let's take a look at first I want to talk about lymphatic capillaries. So I want to show you a picture of what lymphatic capillaries look like, and then we'll go on where I have an outline of the features that lymphatic capillaries have. So again, you're going to find these lymphatic capillaries right next to the capillary beds of blood vessels. So you can see the blood vessels here, right? So we have talked already about the capillary bed. You have an arteriole, that's the smallest of the arteries. You have the venule, and then you have this capillary bed right here. And this is where all the exchange of nutrients and gases are going to occur. And because these vessels are relatively leaky, there is some fluid that's going to leak out in this tissue. And you can see it here. When that fluid leaks out of the circulatory system, it becomes interstitial fluid. We don't want this interstitial fluid around. That would cause some buildup. So we have these lymphatic capillaries nearby, and they are going to pick up this interstitial fluid. Once it enters the capillary, it's going to become lymph. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the structure of these capillaries, but you can get an idea just on this picture alone how this system is working. So let's talk about these capillaries. So lymphatic capillaries, they have a very flat or irregular outline. They're completely different than blood vessels. They don't have that kind of structure to it. They're very irregular, and they're more flattened. All right, they have large luminal diameters. So the lumen of these vessels is pretty large. They have pretty thin walls, and the endothelial cells that line these vessels, they lack a basal lamina, okay? It is just a really thin layer of endothelial cells. And what this does is, what these features do is that they allow a greater permeability. And these, I think I have another picture where I'm going to show you that these endothelial cells, they overlap each other. So instead of being tightly bound with tight junctions or gap junctions, they're going to overlap each other, and that's going to create, I'm going to just kind of draw a very bad picture of a cell. And when they overlap each other like this, they create little valves. So the fluid is able to be pushed into the capillary, and then because they overlap, they're going to create like a little flap, and then that's going to prevent fluid from flowing back out. All right, I have a nice close-up picture of these overlapping endothelial cells. All right, so you can see these lymphatic vessels here. You can tell that they have this irregular shape to them. They're flattened. You can't really tell that in this picture, but you can start to see how these cells form these, like they overlap each other. And so what happens is they create these little flaps. That's what you're looking at right here. So that when the fluid enters, it can't escape, but it could push through and enter, and then that flap kind of shuts closed so that the fluid won't leak back out again. And you can see that there's many entry points for this interstitial fluid to enter these vessels, okay? So they're going to enter the capillaries, and then they're going to flow through the capillaries. I actually have one other picture that shows these flaps, so how those endothelial cells overlap each other. So here's those endothelial cells. Again, that's the capillary bed with the lymphatic capillaries all associated with that bed to pick up that fluid. You can see how these cells, that's the worst color to choose here, how these cells overlap each other. And that creates these little mini valves. So the fluid could push through there, but then as it tries to get back out, those two cells kind of join together and shut so that fluid can no longer escape. All right, so from the lymphatic capillaries, the lymph is going to flow into lymphatic vessels. All right, so lymph flows from the capillaries into larger lymphatic vessels, and this is going to lead toward lymphatic trunks. All right, and again, we are returning interstitial fluid and leaked plasma proteins back to the blood. Now, we take up almost 3 liters a day of lymph. That is how much fluid is leaking out of capillary beds, and why it is so important. My dog is really rolling around and making a lot of noises. Why it is so important that we are able to pick back up this fluid, okay? Because that's a lot of interstitial fluid. And then we've already talked about this point here, probably over and over now. Here's another really nice image showing you how these lymphatic vessels are intertwined with the blood vessels. So you can see that they are readily close by and able to pick up that leaked out fluid. Okay, you can also see its irregular shape in that picture. And then this picture is highlighting how those endothelial cells kind of overlap each other to form these little valves so that the fluid can't get back out again. All right, so just to come back to this summary slide, I just went over these lymph capillaries. All right, and then what happens is these lymph capillaries are going to transition into collecting vessels. And then as we move, so imagine these capillary beds in every tissue, everywhere in your body, your arms, your legs, everywhere where blood vessels are running, so are these lymph capillaries. And from these collecting vessels, they are going to then filter through the lymph node. They're going to end up into lymph trunks and lymph ducts. And then it's going to head back to the heart. So I want to take you and show you how we are going to drain all of this lymph fluid back to the heart. So that is what this next picture is showing you. And this is kind of interesting because usually everything in our body has symmetry to it. So it's usually like everything on the left side is happening on the right side. But this is very different from the lymphatic system, and I don't have an explanation for why this is, but this is the way it is. So let's first talk about the right side of the body. So the right side of the body is highlighted in green. Everything on the right side, so like the right arm, the right part of your thoracic cavity, the right side of your face, the right side of your head, all of that is going to drain into what's called the right lymphatic duct. Okay, and I'm going to show you exactly where in the heart this is draining, but I want you to just understand where this fluid is draining. On the left side of the body, it's completely different. So the thoracic duct is what is going to drain the entire left side of the body. But again, this isn't symmetrical. So actually, both your legs, your left arm, the left abdominal region, the right abdominal region, and then the left upper part of your body and the left part of your face and neck are all going to drain into the thoracic duct, okay? So everything in peach is draining into the thoracic duct. Only a portion of your body is draining into the right lymphatic duct. All right, let me show you a close-up of where this lymph is draining. So I am right up here because we need to drain back into the heart, back into the venous system. So right here you can see the right lymphatic duct, and on this other side, where is it? Here is the thoracic duct on the left side, and they are going to drain into the subclavian vein. So hopefully you remember the subclavian vein. So there's a juncture between the subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein. And that is where the lymphatic system, the lymph, is going to drain back in this kind of section right here on both sides. That is where the lymph is going to drain. So again, you're going to get both of your legs are going to drain, so it's always going back up. It's traveling up, and both of the legs are going to drain into the thoracic duct, and they are going to meet both of the lymph is going to travel, and it's going to merge at an area called the cisterna chyli. So both legs are going to drain. It's going to then merge into the cisterna chyli, and that is what is going to travel all the way up and enter the thoracic duct. I have a summary slide that I put in right here that summarizes the way that lymph is flowing. So again, we started at the lymphatic capillaries. Those were the smallest of the capillaries, and they are the first to receive the lymph. The lymph then enters the collecting ducts. It gets filtered through the lymph nodes, and then it enters and transitions into lymph ducts, lymph trunks, That is what is going to drain entire regions of the body. And then those lymph trunks will merge into lymph ducts, and that is what is going to enter into those veins of the neck and bring that fluid back into the venous system and back into the circulatory system. So that's the way that lymph is transported through the body. So how is this lymph moving? Because it's moving against gravity. And we saw this same scenario with the venous supply. So venous blood is not under pressure the same way as lymph is not under pressure. So we rely on certain areas of our body to move lymph towards the heart. So if you remember that image I showed you in the lower legs, where the veins were associated with, let's say, the gastrocnemius. So as we walk, which is why walking is so good, the muscles contract, and that helps to move the venous blood back towards the heart. The same is true for lymph. So those capillaries, those vessels are also associated with skeletal muscle contraction, or they're associated with skeletal muscle, and by contracting those muscles, we are able to transport lymph. Lymph also is transported or relies on our respiratory pump. So like the movement of our diaphragm. So expansion of the thoracic cage will draw the lymph fluid up from the lower parts of our body and help it move back towards the heart. Secondly, there are valves, as I showed you in the vessels, to help with backflow so that lymph doesn't pool in areas of our body like our lower legs and lower arms. It also can rely on the pulsation of nearby arteries. So arteries are under pressure. They have some pulse to it, right? You can listen to your pulse. And the pulsation of arteries, although it's kind of minor, it does help to move lymph back towards the heart. And then there's also waves of contraction of smooth muscle in some of the vessels of the lymphatic system that will help kind of move this fluid again back towards the heart. So these are all mechanisms to help with lymph transport. All right, now I want to take some time and talk about the cells that I told you were part of the lymphatic system, which are these lymphocytes. And I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about blood and what they do and what like the types of cells that lymphocytes can become. So they are the main warriors of the immune system, and they move around the body. They are in the lymph, okay? And again, they arise from bone marrow, right? We've talked about how these cells are made in the bone marrow. And lymphocytes come in two different varieties. We have the T cells, which I talked again briefly about when I was talking about white blood cells, T cells and B cells. A shorter hand is called T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, but most people call them T cells or B cells. So as I had mentioned before, T cells are managers of the immune response. They can directly attack and destroy infected cells or pathogens that are nearby, whereas B cells are involved in the production of antibodies. And this response is a little bit slower than T cells. It takes a little bit of time for your body to produce antibodies. Antibodies are going to mark antigens. Antigens is another word for foreign objects, pathogens, bacteria, viruses. They're going to mark them for destruction. And so other cells may come along, and we talked about phagocytosis. It's like little Pac-Mans coming around and chewing up things that shouldn't be there. So that's the role of T and B cells. Be sure to know the difference between the two, okay? T cells directly attack, B cells are making antibodies. All right, let's take a closer look at lymph nodes, all right? And you may remember reticular fibers. Remember, reticular fibers are forming that mesh network. That mesh network is what's inside of these lymph nodes. And that gives a nice framework for these lymphocytes to kind of reside in, all right? So you can see these reticular fibers forming that mesh. Remember when we talked about reticular fibers way back when? And we talked about how you can find them in lymph nodes. And so the lymph fluid is going to flow through these lymph nodes, and lymphocytes are going to reside there so that if anything is in that lymph that shouldn't be, those lymphocytes are ready to attack anything that shouldn't be there. So there are various locations which we have these lymph nodes throughout our body. They are gathered in particular regions of our body. So there are lymph nodes in the cervical region, and they are called cervical nodes. We have lymph nodes near and under our armpit, which are axillary nodes. There are abdominal nodes. So most of these lymph nodes you can palpate with your fingers and you can feel them. There are actually a lot of abdominal nodes. You just you don't notice them as much as the other lymph nodes in your body. And then finally, we have areas around the inguinal area where there are lots of lymph nodes. And remember, this is where we are going to filter the lymph as it heads back towards the heart. All right, so let's look at the general anatomy of a lymph node. So these are bean-shaped sized, and they are surrounded by a fibrous capsule. That's the outermost layer of the lymph node. These capsules, you can see that they form trabeculae. So that's what you're seeing right here, all of this structure right in here. And they divide the node into different compartments. Excuse me. So you have a cortex region within the lymph node, and there are various different centers with different cell types that reside in those centers. So what's happening is you have these afferent lymphatic vessels. These are arriving, so the lymph is arriving through these afferent lymphatic vessels. And you can notice that there are many more afferent lymphatic vessels than there are efferent lymphatic vessels. And what this does is it allows the lymph to kind of percolate through the lymph node and stay in there longer, so that all types of, things that shouldn't be there, like pathogens, debris. When I say pathogens, I mean bacteria, viruses, all of those things are taken up by lymph. And then they're filtered through the lymph node, and those foreign agents are then removed from the lymphatic system. So by having many different afferent vessels, you pour that lymph inside the lymph node, and it gives the fluid more time to kind of run through all the different channels of the lymph node. It's going to pass areas where there's a lot of lymphocytes there. And again, lymphocytes can then get rid of those foreign objects. So you're going to have some B cells, you're going to have macrophages in there. And then once the lymph is filtered, it will exit the lymph node through the efferent lymphatic vessel. So there is more anatomy to the lymph node, but I think that we'll just keep it simple for now. And then just realizing that there is that cortex, which is the outer part of the lymph node, and the medulla, which is more of that middle region. And that's where you're going to find those immune cells there to attack anything that shouldn't be there. So let's work through a couple other lymphatic organs, and then we're going to end this lecture. This is a list of all the lymphatic organs, but I'm going to touch on some of these when I go through digestion. So I'm not going to talk about Peyer's patches right now. And we'll talk mostly about the thymus, the spleen. I'm also going to save the appendix for digestion, and we'll talk about the tonsils, but we will revisit that again in a later discussion when we are talking about digestion. So moving on to the spleen. This is the largest lymphatic organ. So blood is going to flow through the spleen. Lymphocytes are going to be there. Remember, they are the cell type of the lymphatic system. They can attack and mark pathogens in the blood that need to be removed. The spleen also produces, monitors, and stores red blood cells. I mentioned that at the very beginning of the talk, and this is actually where red blood cells will go to die. They will make their way to the spleen. They can be destroyed and or recycled there. And another important feature of the spleen is that it is a site of lymphocyte proliferation. This is where lymphocytes can multiply and divide. So that is the spleen. It is located in the left upper quadrant, if you remember from your quadrants. This is a cadaver image of a spleen. So you can see the diaphragm here for reference. The spleen is sitting up against the diaphragm. You can see the splenic artery here. It forms like a nice S shape, and that is what is providing blood to the spleen. The spleen has different areas, just like the lymph node did. So there's what's called a white pulp and a red pulp. And the difference is basically the types of cells that reside in that area. So the white pulp, which is usually associated with arteries, is mostly immune cells. So you're going to find lymphocytes and macrophages, and this is going to help clean the blood and the lymph. And then this red pulp area, which is typically around the veins, this is rich in red blood cells. That's how it kind of gets its name. Both of them, you can remember white pulp because they're white, kind of white blood cells. Red pulp is for red blood cells. Here is an image, cartoon image of what the spleen looks like in cross section. So you can find both that red pulp and white pulp. And again, the spleen is a place where red blood cells and also platelets can be stored. It's highly vascularized. You can see lots of blood vessels there. Finally, we'll talk or mention the thymus. Okay, so the thymus is located right above the heart. So it's superior to the heart, around most of the vessels, the greater vessels. So it's in the inferior neck and it extends into the mediastinum, really right above the heart here. It's interesting because the thymus is where you can find T cells for T for thymus is how I always remember T cells are in the thymus. This tissue is actually important early in life, early in our immune system, and it starts to disintegrate. The thymus, you can't actually see it. It kind of starts to disappear later in life, and we kind of lose a lot of that tissue as we get older. And that is why lots of times the elderly will have a hard time fighting infection because the thymus isn't readily available anymore. It's kind of disintegrated over time. So it stops growing around adolescence. So it's there early in life when we really need our immune system, and then kind of tapers off as we age. And then I will make mention of tonsils, but again, we're going to revisit this when we talk about digestion. It is the simplest of the lymphatic organs. There's four groups of tonsils, and they are located at both the entry point of the respiratory system and the entry point for the digestive system. And this is like the first kind of response for things that we breathe or eat. And so there are immune cells that are located in tonsils that can kind of monitor what we inhale or what we eat. And then these lymphocytes can begin to mount an immune response to ensure that those pathogens don't make entrance into our body. So we have four different types of tonsils. We have the palatine tonsils, lingual, pharyngeal, and tubal tonsils. I think I have a picture of where these tonsils are located here. All right, so here's the pharyngeal tonsil. They're located in the back of the nasal cavity. There are also tubal tonsils that are near this area as well. And then we have two types of tonsils that are in the oral cavity, which are the palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils. And you can see most of these tonsils on the half-head model that we have in class. So we use one side for the facial muscles, and the other side will have depictions of the tonsils as well. And when you're looking at tonsils, you'll notice that there are lots of tonsillar crypts within them. And what this does is it traps and destroys bacteria and particles that we don't want in our body, and it also allows the our immune cells to build memory for these pathogens, so that if they become a constant problem, we will be able to recognize them and get rid of them. All right, so that ends this lecture on the blood and lymphatic system. We will be moving on to the respiratory system next.